There's some big news that just hit the world of college admissions. Brown University just announced that they're going to make students take the ACT or the SAT if they want to get admitted to school there. This makes them the third Ivy League school in just the last month alone to bring back these testing requirements after both Dartmouth and Yale made the same move earlier. So what's going on here? Why are all these top schools bringing back the mandatory testing requirements? Why are they doing it all at the same time right now? And most importantly, what does this mean for high school parents and students? I'm answering all these questions and more in today's video, so stick around to find out. For years, the ACT and SAT were staples in college admissions. For pretty much as long as colleges have existed, these tests have been the most important factor in evaluating whether or not a student will do well in college. It's always been thought that if a student has a high test score, they'll fit right into their college classes and they'll probably outshine a lot of the other students. Therefore, it makes sense that colleges who are trying to build the most successful, cohesive student body that they possibly can will just mostly select from the students with the highest test scores. And so that's how we ended up with testing as a huge part of the college selection process. But then colleges were faced with a wave of backlash against these tests, with many people claiming that standardized testing was unfair to those who didn't score well. Finally, all this backlash built up into 2020 when schools had the perfect excuse for pressing pause on the testing requirements, as most students were physically unable to take the test. And this made schools realize that they could claim a couple of extra benefits from the test optional policies that they put into place. First off, they could please all the critics of standardized testing, claiming that they're being more fair to all the students who are being discriminated against by these low test scores. And second, they could tell these lower scoring students that they still had a chance to get in, convincing more overall students to apply. If a college can increase the number of students who apply to go to school there, it makes them look a lot better on those top college rankings list. And at the same time, having more applications makes their acceptance rate look a lot lower. At the same time, the most elite schools were not really test optional. From all the schools that published the data, students who applied with test scores were way more likely to get into school than students who applied with no test scores. At many of these schools, students who submitted a test score were more than twice as likely to get in than students who submitted no test score at all. And again, all of this data is only from the schools that chose to publish the acceptance rate of students who submitted test scores versus students who didn't submit test scores. So just imagine how big the advantage was for test-taking students at schools that didn't want to submit the data. If they're not publishing the data, then they're probably trying to hide a more skewed acceptance rate between the students who submitted and the students who didn't submit. It's pretty clear that these test-optional schools were really just trying to have the best of both worlds. They wanted to please the standardized test critics, they wanted to have more people apply to their school, and they still just wanted to admit the highest scoring students. But now, all of this is changing. After a couple years of this test optional experiment, schools are looking back at the data and they're finding a number of really concerning things. First off, students who do manage to get into school without submitting a test score end up with significantly worse outcomes at that school compared to students who did submit a test score. Test optional students end up with lower grades in college, they're more unsatisfied with their education, and they transfer more frequently. And all three of those things are factors that negatively impact a college's ranking in the top ranking systems. And the second concerning thing is that studies are now actually showing that while standardized tests may have seemed unfair at first, they actually help level the playing field for college applicants. So now, after a couple years of this test optional experiment, the pendulum is now swinging in the opposite direction. And even though we're only looking at these three schools that have recently brought back the testing requirements, the trend is pretty clear. Other elite schools like MIT and Georgetown have already brought back this requirement. And now that the Ivy League schools are bringing it back as well, most other schools are likely to follow suit. The Ivy League always has been, and probably always will be, the first mover in all these college trends. Since these are the most prestigious schools in the entire US, other schools are quick to jump on board with whatever it is that they're doing. Bringing back mandatory ACT testing is no different here. If you're in high school, or you have a student who's in high school, chances are pretty high that by the time they're applying to college, most schools in the US will have brought back these mandatory ACT requirements. So even though your ACT score was already important during test optional policies, it's going to be even more important to have a great ACT score now that schools are bringing this requirement back in full. So instead of spending time wondering whether or not you should take the ACT or whether you should submit your score if you do take it, at this point, you should know that your time will be much better spent just figuring out different ways to actually improve your ACT score and get it to the best place it possibly can be. And here's how you can stay ahead of the curve and maximize your ACT score. First things first, you need to start early with your preparation. The worst mistake that you can possibly make is waiting until the summer after your junior year or the fall of your senior year to start getting ready for this test. A lot of the concepts that are tested on the ACT are things that were taught back in middle school, freshman year, and sophomore year. So it's naturally going to take some time to refresh all of those concepts that you haven't learned in a while. And second, you need to understand the test. If you're taking the ACT, you have to become familiar with how they test the concepts. They don't just ask direct questions about algebra or grammar rules. They disguise the concepts with confusing questions so that it makes it difficult to understand what they're asking. And if you don't prepare for that, you're leaving tons of points on the table. Points that directly translate to better college admissions and more scholarship dollars. And finally, the third point for getting ready for the ACT is that you have to understand how to identify your weaknesses and how to fix them. This goes right along with understanding the test. But if you don't practice, you won't know where you need to improve. I recommend working with real practice tests and seeing which questions you're missing. Look at every single question that you miss and understand why you missed that question. Maybe you don't understand semicolons, which means you should probably brush up on the specific rules for when those can be used and when they can't be used. However, if you take a couple practice tests and you realize that you never missed any questions on semicolons, you could probably check that one off as something that you don't need to waste your time studying. So now you have the full scoop on all things test optional, and you're completely up to date with the biggest news in college admissions right now. So when you're chatting it up with your friends and everybody's talking about what's going on with Brown and Dartmouth and Yale, you'll already be way ahead of them. And when it comes to getting ready for the ACT, don't forget to start early, understand the test, and find and prepare for your particular weaknesses. If you can do these three things, then you don't have to worry at all about colleges bringing back their mandatory testing requirements. In fact, it will actually help you out because you'll rise up above everybody else. Do you have any thoughts on what's going on with these ACT requirements and the test optional policies? Drop them down in the comments below. I'm interested to hear what you think. Other than that, stay tuned to the channel for more information on navigating the college admissions process.